The Rebel Capitalist Show. Okay, so let's dive into it here. I've got my questions written down. I wanted to be prepared. The first thing I'd really like you to explain to my viewers is it's something that the average Joe just has a really hard time understanding. And that's why currency doesn't equal purchasing power or consumption, and production and productivity does. They just see the Fed, as an example, printing this money, and they see that, well, if you deposit that money or currency into my bank account, I can buy more stuff. So doesn't that equal purchasing power? But as you've explained so many times, it doesn't. But just if you could break that down to a third grade level as to why it's all about production.
Yeah, because that's probably the level at which most U.S. high school graduates are probably reading. But your audience might be a little bit better educated than the third grade. But if you look at what's happening right now, in particular with the relief plans that are being announced regarding the coronavirus and what everybody is saying, you listen to those Democratic debates from Sunday night and Biden and Sanders, the government's going to make everybody whole. The government's going to pay your mortgage. The government's going to pay your rent. The government's going to give you health care. The government's going to make sure you don't lose any money. And everybody is like, yeah, that's great. The government could just give everybody money because everybody knows that the government creates the money, or the Federal Reserve creates the money. And for some reason, sometimes they're stingy with it. They don't want to share it, But during times of emergency, all of a sudden, they're going to give everybody some money. Mnuchin was saying today that, well, it's no fault of Americans that this happened. And so therefore, we want to make sure that nobody suffers. So we're going to give everybody money. Like the government is sitting on this pile of money. But, people don't want money per se. They want the things that they can buy with money. But the money is the cart. The stuff is the horse. You need to produce things. For money to have any purchasing power, there must be goods and services to purchase, right? In the absence of goods and services, money has no value, right? If you're stranded on a desert island and you're really thirsty and hungry and someone gives you a bunch of money, what good is it? If there's no food and there's no water, there's nothing that you could do with that money. And so for money to have value, paper money anyway, I mean, gold, real money, has intrinsic value all by itself because you could do something with gold. You could use it. But you can't do anything with paper. You have to exchange it for something. But that means that something has to exist. So it has to be produced into existence, or somebody has to expend labor to provide you with a service. And the government can print money, but they can't create products. They don't provide services that you want. The marketplace has to do that. So when the government just creates money and nobody is doing any work to add products or services into the economy, then all they're doing is destroying the value of the money you already have. Because of the new money, the existing goods and services become more expensive to the point where there's no real purchasing power created by government printing money and giving it to the populace, which is really what they're doing now. And so people have to understand that money is simply a claim to production. But if there's no production, then it's really not a claim on anything. All it does is reduce the value of the claims that already exist.
Right. So a couple things there. I want people to understand how the transfer mechanism works from the starting point. Let's say the Fed prints money. It goes into the reserve accounts, let's say for the primary dealers. And then from that standpoint, the primary dealers, let's say they have to do something with it. They create another deposit, or the government spends it and then has to borrow the money. So that creates another deposit. And then how does that get into the real economy to where it can circulate and chase those goods?
Well, basically all that happens is the government itself, which is separate from the Fed, which is not technically part of the government, but it functions as if it was part of the government. But what happens is the government borrows money, like they just announced today, another $850 billion stimulus, whatever plan. They're going to send checks to Americans. So what happens is the U.S. government then has to sell a bond, and the dealers go out into the market and buy the bonds from the government with money they get from the Fed. And then these dealers take the bonds and sell them back to the Fed. And so the bonds go on the balance sheet of the Fed, and the Federal Reserve creates a deposit that goes from the primary dealer to the checking account of the U.S. government, so that when the money is sent out to the taxpayer, he gets a check that he can cash. But basically, the government is borrowing that money into existence by issuing a treasury bond that eventually goes to the Federal Reserve. There is now Federal Reserve notes in circulation, which are the dollars that we have, which are now liabilities of the Fed, and they're backed up by the treasury bonds that the Fed now has on its balance sheet. And that's how the balance sheet, exploded up to $4.5 trillion during quantitative easing, because the Federal Reserve bought up all these treasuries and mortgage-backed securities and replaced them with cash that is now circulating in the economy, and that was used to bid up, financial assets and things like that. But there's no real production of goods and services that are going on here. I mean, people have to realize there's an old saying that I forget. I think it was a president. I forget. But the government or the people have to support the government, but the government can never support the people. But today people think that the government could support everybody, that the government could provide free stuff. They can't. The government only has what it takes from the people. Now, it has various ways it can take it. It can do it honestly by just raising taxes on the people, but it can also borrow money, and the people don't necessarily see that cost, but they still bear it because they have to repay the loans. So when the government is borrowing money, it is simply deferring taxes to the future, plus interest, because the lender charges interest. Or if the Federal Reserve ends up monetizing the debt, quantitative easing, whatever they want to call it, and the Fed buys the bonds, then they do it by creating money, which destroys the value of the money that already exists. So people are robbed of their purchasing power instead of being robbed of their money.
Yeah, so that's a great explanation. And so now we understand how the additional money that's being printed by the Fed or being spent by the government gets into the real economy. But then to add to that, the situation that we have now with the coronavirus, I heard you say this on your podcast Monday, which was fantastic, probably one of the best episodes I've ever heard. But you talked about there being a supply shock. So we've got this additional money supply, potentially not just chasing the same amount of goods and services, but actually fewer goods and services, which would really spike that inflation for consumer prices. Can you explain that a little further?
Yeah, exactly. Well, obviously, due to the coronavirus, people are sick, and those sick people are not productive. But more importantly, there are a lot of people who don't want to get sick, or who simply don't want to spread a virus that they don't know they may have. So everybody is kind of isolating themselves and trying to interact less frequently with other individuals. And so people aren't going to work. People aren't, as productive as they used to be. So factories aren't producing as much stuff, or they're not producing the components that other factories need to make their stuff. So we're less productive. We're staying at home and taking some time off, right? So we're not making things. So what the federal government really should be doing is shrinking the money supply so that, we have price stability. If that's their goal, if we're producing less stuff, then we need less money, right? But what they're doing is they say, no, we want to give people more money. We want to put money in people's pockets. But what good is that going to do if there's less stuff for people to buy? So it just accelerates the inflationary process. I mean, what is keeping a lid on it is that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, and a lot of the money that we create just, ends up being exported. But if that happens to a lesser degree, I mean, our trade deficit's going to come down if the Chinese aren't producing as much stuff anymore to ship to us. So more and more of that cash is going to just stay around here. And what are Americans going to do with it? Well, they're going to the supermarkets, trying to buy food, stock up on food or other supplies. But eventually they're going to run out, and just prices are going to start to go up.